All right, so welcome to today's event. My name is Dr. Brian J. Griffith. I'm an assistant professor of European history here at Fresno State, and I'll be your host for today's Fresno State History Department book talk with Dr. Simone Cinotto, who I will be officially introducing here in just a moment. Following my introduction for Dr. Cinotto, he will deliver a 40 to 45 minute presentation on his new monograph, which you see here, Gastrofascism and Empire, Food in Italian East Africa, 1935 to 1941, which will be followed by a Q&A session during the time that remains in our meeting. If you have a question that you would like to ask during the Q&A session, simply raise your hand and I'll come by and take your question in turn. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Simone Cinotto. Dr. Cinotto is a professor of modern history at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Fresno, Italy, where he is the director of the master's program in World Food Studies and reference professor for Fulbright cultural exchange programs between Italy and the United States. In addition to his role at the University of Gastronomic Sciences, Simone has served in a variety of different capacities at different academic institutions on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, including visiting professor / visiting scholar, depending upon the institution, at Indiana University, New York University, Columbia University, the list actually is quite long, University of Heidelberg, University of Warsaw, University of London, Cornell University, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Dr. Cinotto serves on the editorial boards for several academic journals, including prestigious Gastronomica, Food, Culture, and Society, Global Food History, and the Italian American Review. Additionally, Simone is the editor of several scholarly anthologies, such as Making Italian America, Consumer Culture, and the Production of Ethnic Identities, published by Fordham University Press in 2014, Food Mobilities, Making World Cuisines, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2023, and An Ocean of Style, Production and Consumption of Made in Italy in the Post-War United States, published by Mimesis in 2023. And that's just to name a few of the anthologies that he's been editor for. Beyond these editorial projects, Dr. Cinotto is the author of several research and highly cited, I might point out, monographs, including one of my personal favorites, Soft Soil, Black Grapes, The Birth of Italian Winemaking in California, published by New York University Press in 2012, The Italian-American Table, Food, Family, and Community in New York City, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2013, and of course the subject of today's book talk, Gastrofascism and Empire, Food in Italian East Africa, 1935 to 1941, published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2024. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Simone Cinotto.
Thank you, and thank you so very much, Brian, for this very generous introduction. This is just the last of so many treats that you have provided me. Starting with inviting me here, it's a wonderful opportunity. And I also want to thank the Department of History and the library for this. I really love this room, full of light. Usually they put me in a little basement, old in the 19th century, moldy. This is really fantastic. And especially I want to thank you for being here today. It's a beautiful day. So I really appreciate your time and attention. And okay, so what I'm going to do is try to summarize the book in, I think I have 40 minutes. I already used probably 2-3 of them. And with the help of the slides, which include not this particular slide, but all other slides. They include the illustrations, some of the illustrations, a few of the illustrations that are in the book, and maybe if you have not read your book yet, maybe these images will help you ask a question if you want this question. Yeah, I think and then there will be, of course, the Q&A space for you to ask me anything you wanna ask me. Again, thank you so much for. I know that many of you, except for maybe the colleagues here, you're gonna study this period of time. The third is in European history and Africa history, I guess, in a couple of weeks. So you may lack a little bit of the historical context, historical facts, events, a little bit for now. Consider this, we're talking about food, consider this an appetizer. So 2-3 weeks, I got that guy from Italy. And now I know what you're talking about. Okay. Okay, let's go. With a critical decision that ultimately accelerated the onset of World War II, Italian Prime Minister, that's called Duce, Benito Mussolini, ordered the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, followed by the proclamation of the Italian Empire in 1936, with the primary goal of transforming Africa's less independent country at the time, into the Italian breadbasket, supplying the expanding Italian nation with the bread and pasta it required. Lacking the energy resources to compete with the international great powers, those of the second industrial revolution, coal, oil, gas, natural gas, and so on and so forth, Fascist Italy relied on a demographic strategy based on population growth, which required abundant calories to sustain. Food imperialism in Ethiopia represented the culmination of domestic food policies established during the 1920s, aimed at achieving self-sufficiency, they call it autarky, focusing on cheaper, substantial carbohydrates. The battle for grain restructured Italy's highly diversified agricultural system to prioritize wheat production, while the development of genetically modified, high-yield, pest-resistant wheat strains was pursued on a massive scale. Basically these very important food policies for the fascist regime aimed at so-called battle for grain, which was a call to the arms of the all Italian people, but especially farmers, reconverting Italian agriculture that back then, like now, probably you have a little bit in mind the physical map of Italy. It's a very narrow peninsula that starts with the tallest, the crown, the tallest mountains in Europe, and then it goes down. It's right in the middle of the Mediterranean, with Sicily right at the center, much more closer to Northern Africa than the rest of Europe, and so on and so forth. And it basically lacks any. It's the opposite of the valley. There's no significant place where to grow, extensively cereals, for example, with the exception of the Po Valley, where in fact the Italian food industry is concentrated, the place where Parmigiano Reggiano and Prosciutto di Parma. So it was really a political, very strong political action to turn an agriculture that is based on small farming for the most part into the extensive production of cereals. These policies, accompanied by a blood soil rhetoric that celebrated farmers as custodians of traditional knowledge and guardians of the national landscape, pride in national cuisines, and paranoia about contamination from foreign foodways, shaped the politics of food and taste that they termed gastrofascism, the integration of food into the ideology and practices of nationalist, authoritarian, and totalitarian regimes. Okay, maybe I need to say this. The history of food, which basically is the history of humankind, because food is something that is super universal. Without food, we die. So absolutely every human being, Homo sapiens, need to eat. At the same time, is extremely diversified. There are basically people in different places, in different cultures, eat tremendously different food. Basically, which is one of the most important topics, in my opinion, in food history. And the reason why there is this situation, extremely diversified tastes for food, diversified diet. The one historical factor explaining this is actually the empire. The empire put in motion people, but also plants, animals, and so on and so forth, so that they, especially modern empires, after as part of what is called the Columbian exchange, all the mobility of people, plants and animals between the old world of Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas. It explains why if you scrap every kind of foodways, you see that pretty much nothing in that food culture is from a particular place. I'll give you an example. The tomato, especially tomato sauce, is really the icon of Italian cuisine, both on spaghetti or in lasagna or on pizza, of course, and so on and so forth. And Italians love to think that it's always been like that for thousands and thousands of years. The tomato is a plant that was first fruit or vegetable or whatever. Is a plant that was domesticated originally by the Aztec and the Maya in Central America, and because of most of Italy at the time was part of the Spanish Empire, exactly like Mexico. This fruit travel in the imperial flows of the circulation of plants that were completely, of course, unknown in Europe, arrived in Italy very, very early on. It took about 3 centuries before it was understood as food, and then for some women around Naples who said, "Oh, you can make a sauce out of it," and especially if you have a source of it, and under the very, very hot summer southern Italian sun, if you keep on stirring, you get a paste that can be preserved for a very, very long time, which was the big dilemma of traditional rural society, preserving food. While the attempted construction of the Italian empire of food in East Africa shared many characteristics with previous European imperialism, Fascist Italy's plans for the colonization of Ethiopia were something else. They aimed at elevating all their imperial food system to hypermodern level, encompassing political, technoscientific, environmental, and nutritional dimensions. Like you see soon, and I also already mentioned, this was the occupation of Ethiopia with the goal of creating an Italian empire in East Africa was the last example, where in 1935, the last example of European imperialism in Africa. So the technology was an extremely modern effort at realizing an empire of food. The broader narrative of racist mass settler colonialism, promoted as a national struggle for food sovereignty, was different from the plantation and trade-based colonialism of other empires. Fascist Italy colonization of Ethiopia was a biopolitical project, grounded in the belief that all forms of life, human and non-human, belong to specific places and environments. In the fascist empire of food, the mobilization of people and resources were orchestrated at a state-directed transplantation of settlers, animals, and plants. Hierarchical racial ideology governed colonial interactions, applied not only to white Italians and black Ethiopians, we need to return to this look at that soon, but also to edible plants and domesticated animals, all forms of life. Institutionalized state colonial racism aimed to prevent the feared and despised mixing of races and breeds, as well as teach Italians to become a master race by exercising dominance over Ethiopians. This racist ideology applied to people, non-human animals, plants, tastes, and cuisines, explained why in Italian-occupied Ethiopia, interracial food exchange was prohibited not only in public spaces, such as segregated cafes, bars, restaurants, and markets, but also within the private sphere of the home. The domestic sharing of food between an Italian man and an Ethiopian woman was punished as the ultimate sign of an intimate, affectionate relationship, which could result in the birth of mixed-race children, the ultimate threat to fascist imperial society. Ultimately, while the empire of food in East Africa failed to deliver the calories required to fuel the demographic expansion of the Italian nation as initially envisioned, it succeeded in cultivating a new breed of imperial Italian consumers, both in the colonies and in the metropole. Italian consumers came to view the consumption of both familiar and exotic colonial foods as an entitlement, made possible by the cheap and expendable labor of colonized people. Fascist Italian imperialism in East Africa was simultaneously the most modern form of imperialism the world had experienced at the time, due to the transfer of advanced biotechnology applicable to agriculture, and one of the most archaic and expensive, relying on mass armed conquest and rural settlement for food production. This is a Mussolini idea of empire. Mussolini went on and on, he said, our colonialism in Africa should be the opposite of British colonialism. Not just some handful, a few white people putting the local people at work and extracting all the wealth for their own benefit, but an empire like the Roman Empire of 2,000 years before was. An imperialism of the people, the settlers, the settler in Ethiopia, which was supposed to be provide the ideal environment to produce bountiful food, and basically, pretty much that was the ultimate goal: displace the Ethiopians. Okay, not integrating them in agriculture, but in the European agriculture, but basically claiming the land and marginalize them more and more. And the idea also was that the example of the Roman Empire was useful to imagine this soldier, like the Roman soldier of a couple of millennia before, that first fight to conquer the land, and then they drop the rifle and grab the plow and start working the land that they just conquered. But a very old-fashioned idea of imperialism. Italian scientists were extensively co-opted to study Ethiopian soil and climate and to determine how best to transplant desired food plants and animal breeds into Ethiopia. L'Istituto Agronomico per Oltremare, Overseas Agricultural Institute in Florence, oversaw the selection process for strains and breeds. These are the specimen of the desired plants, the sperm of bulls, everything. East Africa was envisioned as a natural extension of Italian farming, not a distant colonies, but a coherent, addition of farmlands. But it was supposed to become Italian in every respect. Italian farmers and their families were to be similarly transplanted from parts of Italy with the highest labor surpluses, unemployed people or poor peasants, to areas of Ethiopia deemed most similar to their regions of origin. Mussolini openly despised British-type capitalist colonialism, which he claimed benefited only the wealthiest few. Consequently, fascist plan for colonization of Ethiopia centered on the establishment of state-supported model settlement. Well, this was a model called regional agencies for colonization. So it was supposed to be farmers and their families from a particular place in Italy, transplanted the whole community in a particular place, land in Ethiopia that was, constructed and being very, very similar to the original place. This is a very right-wing idea that, again, every form of life belong to a specific environment. They wanted to keep that consistent. In these settlements, after Ethiopians had been displaced, Italian farmers were to implement technological advanced European agriculture, featuring the miracle seeds developed by Italian geneticists. Colonial planners envisioned Italian Ethiopia operating with two distinct agricultural systems. Ethiopian would subsist on their traditional agriculture and indigenous crops, such as staff in the islands of the north and set, or false banana in Oromia, in the south, which the fascist colonies deemed unimportant. While the colonies, the settlers, would focus on the large-scale production of wheat, beef, coffee, and banana. Fascist crops I talk about here. This crop selection was heavily influenced by the theory of the centers of origins of cultivated plants developed by Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov. The Abyssinian Islands, being the center of origin for many domesticated cereals, and southwestern Ethiopia, the birthplace of Arabica coffee. Coffee is called like that because this Arabica, its most important strain, come from the area of Kaffa, which is an actual town in southern Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, because it was the birthplace of these plants, was considered especially promising for these endeavors. Wheat farming was paramount, as it was intended not only to feed the projected 3 million settlers of Italians in East Africa, but also supply Italians back in Italy, again, feeding the nation. However, cultivating Italian high-yield hybrid wheat plants in complete isolation from local biodiversity proved disastrous. The plants failed to adapt to the Ethiopian environment. By 1939, Italian agronomists had reversed course, attempting to integrate their miracle seeds into local multi-cereal farming system. Coffee, Ethiopia's primary export before the Italian occupation in independent Ethiopia, was not intended for domestic Italian consumption. Italy imported coffee from Brazil at a fraction of the cost of Ethiopian coffee. That's a little bit of a contest. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia was condemned by almost all the international community. At the time, it was not the UN, it was called the League of Nations, basically the predecessor of, but at the same function. And so most countries, Great Britain, France, the United States, and so on and so forth, declare an embargo on Italy. So that's one of the reasons why this project, megalomaniac project of feeding millions and millions of Italians with the wheat coming from the empire failed, and instead the diet, the calorie intake of Italians from the mid-30s to World War II was a disaster for Italy, beginning with hunger, widespread decline. The opposite happened. But this course was very, very important in a matter of taste. It's basically, in many ways, the political invention of what in the late 60s started to be called the Mediterranean diet. Okay, so what the fascist regime did is to reverse what had been, especially the early 20th century, identified by anthropologists, doctors, and so forth, as the Italian food issue. Italians, north to south, especially rural areas, ate very, very, very little animal protein. Basically almost zero beef. Okay? A consequence of that is that they, this is a time when racism was supposed to be a science. They were rated extremely poorly when compared to Northern European and white American people, also non-white American people. So when the young Italian man was drafted, and they, when they drafted me in the army, unfortunately, I had to go. Unbelievable. Was part of my biography. Anyway, that is I still am so old that I still now young people don't need to. Anyway, so they measure so and so forth, and they were this shorter of the French, this shorter of the German, this shorter of the British, and then even this shorter of the children and grandchildren of American slaves. And so that the lack of animal protein take into their body explained because they were terrible soldiers, but also terrible workers, terrible mothers, and so on and so forth. Fascism is using also the leverage of the embargo, so blaming some, the other people, other nations said, well, wait a second, we're Italians, we're let's say, Latin race, and so on and so forth. Let the Northern Europeans add the beef that they want. Our staff of life is bread, again, the Roman imperial tradition of wheat, and so on and so forth. By the way, there are some proverbs in Italian. One of them, buono come il pane. It's like it was somebody is very nice, is very sweet. You associate him or her with bread. And these proverbs were basically introducing this. And so fascism started celebrating as super patriotic, for example, the housewives that cook with nothing, unbelievably delicious foods for the family, for their husband, their children, and so on and so forth. So they celebrated the art of making great food with leftovers, everything that was available, and so on and so forth. Believe me, my grandma was exactly like that. Exactly like that. So yeah, the political taste, and then in retrospect, couple decades after the fall of fascism and Mussolini was long gone, American doctors, particularly Ansel and Margaret Keyes, did research in southern Italy, and they popularized this idea of the Mediterranean diet with very little saturated fat, very little special fats from meat and dairy and so on and so forth, but instead cereals, pasta, a lot of greens, the food of the poor in Italy in the 30s, the 50s, and so on and so forth, like the healthiest diet of all. So there was this vengeance, late vengeance of Mussolini's idea about food and taste. Okay, aspetta. We're talking about coffee. Yeah, coffee. So coffee was not supposed to be imported into Italy to enrich the now I remember why I took the tangent. The only two countries that did not join in the embargo against Italy were Nazi Germany. In fact, that was tremendously important in determining the alliance between Mussolini and Hitler, with the consequences, and Brazil. Getúlio Vargas, another fancy dictator in Brazil. So these were the two remaining important trade partners from Italy, and Brazilian coffee was incredibly cheaper than to grow, transport, and so forth than the Ethiopian coffee. Even when Italy was when Ethiopia was an Italian coffee, so there was this paradox of most of the coffee in Italy arriving from Brazil, and most of the coffee drank by Italians in Ethiopia being also the Brazilian coffee that went into the global market through to the port of Santos out of São Paulo. The importance of infrastructure also tremendously relevant in this. The Abyssinia, the Ethiopian coffee, which like exactly right now, was very, very high quality. So high quality that basically now we have this concept of single origin, and we enjoy that. But it's a super postmodern kind of concept. It was used to give flavor to blends with Robusta coffee, mostly from Brazil and so forth. But it was very, very expensive, and so basically it was supposed to become the crop, the commodity that was traded in global markets and basically fund the entire project of the empire and ultimately the production of wheat. I don't know if I gave you the idea. So lacking expertise. Italian coffee farmers had to rely on Ethiopian knowledge, but never came close to matching the export level achieved under Alessa Seai before the Italians arrived. This failure undermined the plan to make coffee the cornerstone product financing the entire biofuel. The only product Italians managed to produce and export on a large scale was bananas, cultivated on capitalist plantation in Somalia using indentured local labor, not the model settlement that Mussolini envisioned. Accordingly, while coffee was portrayed in food magazines, food books, and advertisements as an unhealthy bourgeois vice, Somali bananas were promoted as a wholesome addition to the Italian diet, easily incorporated to a variety of delicious recipes. Again, qualities of taste. So there's a little bit of overlapping of the caption there. Of critical importance was that concurrently with the start of rural colonization, Mussolini ordered the hyper-ambitious construction of a road infrastructure intended to transport farmers to the settlements and extract food resources from the new Ethiopian farmlands. Wheat and bananas were to be shipped to Italy, while coffee was destined for global markets to generate valuable foreign currency. The timing proved disastrous. Mussolini's Ethiopian highways drained massive human and financial resources away from the development of large-scale demographic settled colonial agriculture. Both Italian and Ethiopian workers found better paying and more secure employment opportunities outside of agriculture, particularly in construction, as truck drivers or as merchants. Additionally, the Italian army failed to achieve the pacification of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian resistance relentlessly targeted Italian rural settlements, attacking trains, convoys, and trucks, supplying the settlement with food. The persistent attacks terrorized settlers who ventured beyond the relative safety of urban areas. As a result, Italian settlers concentrated in Addis Ababa and other major colonial cities. Paradoxically, the ambitious imperial road infrastructure, originally intended to transport settlers and colonial goods, instead carried tons of important canned, bottled, and packaged foods from the consumption of Italian settlers in Ethiopian cities. Settlers viewed these imported modern products as the most welcome sign that their African experience had elevated them to the lifestyle and status of the middle class. They enjoyed the domestic help of Ethiopian servants and an unprecedented level of private consumption, something Italians in Italy would not experience until the economic boom of the 1960s, if at all. Italians believed canned food could function as a tool to impress Ethiopians with Italian modernity and to discipline them into modernity. However, the material culture of ubiquitous canned and packaged food was equally significant for the settlers themselves. It symbolized social mobility and freed them from what they perceive as the danger of African food. Bottled spring water was nearly unknown in Italy at the time. In Ethiopia, it became extremely popular. Empty food cans often found secondary uses, serving as improvised construction materials and, in one notorious case, as a container for the severe ad of Ethiopian resistance leader Haile Selassie. Empty food cans left a lasting and painful impression in Ethiopian memory as a symbol of fascist oppression and racism. Ethiopians recall being left outside bars and restaurants they were forbidden to enter, segregated places, and being served their food in rusty tomato cans, while Italians dined in proper cups, glasses, and plates. They went to Ethiopia being farmers and peasants from rural areas. They arrived in Ethiopia where we were supposed to settle and start this super advanced European agriculture and so forth, ended up in cities, and so ended up becoming consumers in Ethiopia. My first book called The Italian American Table is about the foodways of Italian immigrants to New York in the 1920s. Same process. From the most backward and terrible countryside in all of Europe, again, like I said before, consumption of certain product almost nearing zero, not only beef but also coffee, sugar, and so on and so forth. They arrived in the most modern metropolis of the world at the time, but they could not, raise the pigs or the chickens. So they tried, but in their little villages, and instead they become modern consumers, including women that were used to walk a long distance to get water from the pit. Now they have running water, and they were used to cook the one pot food on a fireplace. Now they have the gas stove, that kind of stuff. And then, so they were very, very glad, actually, especially the people who went to Ethiopia. Anyway, so this paradox, if you want, is you cannot see it because it's too small. This is the trade balance between Italy and the empire in East Africa in 1938. The import is mostly food. They imported almost 2 billion lire of the time, and the export, mostly bananas, is 135,000 euro a fraction. In Italian East Africa, state racism influenced food in all its dimensions, from the engineering of agriculture and the enforcement of racially segregated commensality to the way food signaled racial boundaries and distinctions. In the fascist colonial project, Italians, not Africans, were intended to farm the land as laborers, are all historically stigmatized as akin to slavery. Segregation was therefore necessary, in Mussolini's view, to sustain the narrative that the invasion of Ethiopia by Italian farmer soldiers was a civilizing mission. It also allowed Italian settlers to maintain their supposed racial superiority while performing labor associated with African workers. In fact, another trope. Ethiopians, when I say Ethiopians, actually the Abyssinians, the Amara, and Tigrinians who held the power in the Ethiopian Empire. When Italians arrived, by the way, Italy was not an empire. Ethiopia was not only the only independent country in Africa, but it was an empire. Because first Menelik II, and then Haile Selassie basically had just conquered the rest of what is now Ethiopia to the east, to the south, and to the west, and created the Ethiopian, the Ethiopian Empire. I was talking about the okay. So when they saw these Italian peasant from Italy, okay, not acting like the British counterpart, with the fancy colonial hat and the jacket and so on and so forth, but in underwear, building the roads, or farming the land, they said, this is the trope, they said, oh, Italians brought with them their white slaves. They said the guragi. They brought with them their own guragi, because the guragi is an ethnic group that basically performed the kind of work for the Abyssinia. They were colonized people from that. Okay? And so it was because of this situation. Okay, Mussolini insisted a lot on that there were to be segregation was helpful in maintaining. He called it the prestige of the race. Italians always conduct themselves like they were the master race. They have to learn to be. They have to learn to be the master race. But that was one of the important subproduct of. The empire, the colonization of empire. They had to learn that they were white, something that especially Southern Italian were unfamiliar with. In Italian Ethiopia, public spaces for food preparation and consumption were among the most strictly segregated. A little bit like the American South in the Jim Crow, apartheid South Africa. Public spaces for food preparation and consumption were among the most strictly segregated. Restaurants and cafes were zoned to minimize opportunities for Italians and Ethiopians to interact closely or as equals. The sharing of food, plates, or physical contact at the table was strictly prohibited. Mussolini's greatest concern, however, was that Italian men and Ethiopian women might produce a mixed-race population that did not fit within fascist racial categories. Although prostitution remained legal and was in fact widely encouraged, the 1937 racial laws for the colonies introduced the crime of madamato, a marriage-like, intimate, and affectionate relationship between an Italian man and a colonized woman. These women that before Ethiopia, Italy had two older colonies, Libya and Eritrea. In Eritrea, it was these Eritrean women, kind of liberally married Italian men, even if the Italian men already had a family, maybe probably kids in Italy, there were these marriages, and these women were called madame, like from madame in French, and this was basically largely tolerated. I mean, like don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. There was no legal implication, and so on and so forth. Again, with Mussolini hyper-racist vision of the empire, that changed. In colonial courts, so in front of any judge, two forms of evidence were considered definitive proof of an international conjugal relationship. One, the couple regularly slept together, every night, same bed, and there was no money transaction. That would have been cool. There was no. They made love. This is all. And two, second evidence, they share meals at the same table. In other words, international commensality in the privacy of the home was a crime in Italian East Africa. Many Italian men were sentenced to up to 3 years in prison and deportation for being caught in such relationships, with the act of sharing food as equals serving as key evidence. The repression of interracial food sharing at home had multiple consequences. One significant outcome was that Italian men often attempted to disguise their Ethiopian partners as domestic help. As a result, young Ethiopian men, not women, predominantly performed domestic work in Italian colonial households. So there were these young, mostly young, very young men, boys, being represented in 99% of the domestic help of servants in Italian colonial colonial households. The prohibition again experiences the food of the other, extended from the ban of using black wet nurses to breastfeed Italian babies, to urban planning that mandated separated Italian and indigenous marketplaces was enforced. All this prohibition for interaction in terms of food, including creating different markets, which you think about it is not only crazy but stupid idea. Because the markets are, the most obvious place for exchange. The market is where you trade stuff, trade barter, whatever you do with other people. So if you segregate the markets, you make them only poorer and less useful, and so on and so forth. So there was this dilemma. This prohibition rested on an unresolved dilemma that ultimately made segregation untenable. If Italians had come to Ethiopia to reap the bounty of valuable food that the land provided, how could they simultaneously describe Ethiopian food as disgusting, the product of a backward agriculture performed by inferior primitive people? In fact, despite the rigid segregation, an active Ethiopian-Italian colonial food exchange emerged in the margins, at the borders of these separated worlds. From this interaction, a distinctive hybrid cuisine and taste began to take shape. There's an entire chapter of the book about this. Initially, first encounters were often dominated by feeling of disgust and nausea toward the food of the other. Italians in particular, despite injera, the flat bread made from teff, the spicy berbere, and the pervasive smell of bitter kibbeh, clarified and spiced butter used by Ethiopian women for both cooking and as an hair cosmetic. This is another enormous trope. Ethiopian women, for their part, thought that spaghetti looked like worms. However, over time, informal crossings of gastronomic racial lines became commonplaces. As rural colonization faltered, Italians increasingly relied on Ethiopian for fresh food, such as fruits, vegetables, eggs, milk, butter, and chickens. Simultaneously, Ethiopians selectively incorporated processed and packaged food imported from Italy into their cooking, creating a subtle, unofficial fusion of culinary practices. To this day, Ethiopia, at least a third or fourth country for consumption of pasta in the world. Very, very heavy pasta consumers. And they totally stand out over other African countries for the consumption. Food encounters occurred across many different margins of the imperial landscape. In the army, where colonial soldiers, called the Ascari, taught Italians how to cook with local ingredients. In Italian colonial homes, where Ethiopian men performed most of the domestic work, including shopping and cooking, Italian women could not patronize the natives markets where most of the fresh food was, so they had to send the little boy shopping for them, and so on and so forth. In the context of prostitution, a trade that boomed due to the massive demand from Italian men, where food and beverages were often offered along sex, and Italian food was sometimes used as payment for sex work. At banquets hosted by both Ethiopian and Italian leaders as part of their diplomatic engagements, what now it's called gastro-diplomacy, and within the families formed by Italian men who had abandoned white society, which were called they were the so-called insabbiati, people lost in the sand. These basically dropouts of Italian society with the Ethiopian women and their children in Ethiopian villages. So there were people. That's why insabbiati, lost in Africa, have been gold-put by Africa. This is an ad for Perugina chocolate. Okay, so very quick digression. there was no, basically, minimal and ridiculous low production of cocoa in the colonies. But chocolate, just like coffee, because of the color, the dark brown, and especially because these two products are the quintessential, also brown sugar if you want, but the Europeans started refining it and turning it into white, so it lost the kind of implication. So chocolate and coffee, because of the color, and because they were colonial products made by dark people in the global south, they could not be produced in Europe. They were perfect for the conflation of this idea that when you consume chocolate or coffee, you're consuming the bodies of the people that produces that product. You consume it also in a sexualized way, or anyway, or as a matter of an entitlement that you acquire to be an empire, to be an imperial consumer, and so on and so forth. So these illustrators, they were they were the Italian equivalent of Norman Rockwell, super famous illustrator, and they work a lot in advertising. There was an art that was really emerging at the time. They frequently use food imagery to depict African bodies and landscape, intertwining the consumption of colonial food with the consumption of the colonized other. Their work blended the pleasure of the senses, both sexual and gastronomic, into a fantasy of a colonial world promising boundless consumption. In his advertising for Maro Ramazzotti, left, for example, Boccasile depicted an unrealistic scenario. Few Italian women ever moved to occupy Ethiopia, and those who did were not served by bare-breasted Ethiopian women, but by young Ethiopian men, boys, mostly. Boccasile's portrayal of Ethiopian domestic workers, both feeding and sexual service, as suggested by the looming exaggerated penis shape of the soda dispenser, compresses the black body and the food commodity, symbolizing the act of swallowing and consuming, with the ultimate promise of pleasure. On their part, the Ethiopian women objectified in this advertisement, who in Ethiopian society were gendered as only responsible for the transformation, processing, and preparation of food, and would disproportionately endure the physical violence of Italian aggression, rape, actively embrace cuisine as a powerful counter-colonial weapon. This is something that you can find in the most successful, ever-winning post-colonial literature about Italian and Ethiopia. Mazza Benghiste, the Shadow of the Lion King, is the probably most important of those books. So Ethiopian women persisted in cooking and eating traditional decolonized food as a strategy of participation in the anti-imperialist struggle for freedom. So, in conclusion, the experience of the Italian empire of food in East Africa reshaped the identities and politics of place for all subjects involved, transformed agricultural landscape and biodiversity, and fostered new transnational and global connection, as well as power dynamics. Thank you so very much for your patience.